The morning air at Camp Pendleton carried the sharp scent of gun oil and desert sage as Corporal Riley Ashford stepped off the transport truck. Her boots hit the gravel with a soft crunch that was swallowed by the shouting of drill instructors and the rhythmic pounding of boots on the parade ground. She kept her eyes forward, her dark hair pulled tight beneath her cover, her frame slight against the backdrop of towering mountains that ringed the base. Nobody looked at her twice. That was how she preferred it. The advanced marksmanship course drew the best shooters from across the Marine Corps, and the competition started before anyone ever touched a rifle. Riley could feel the weight of assessment in every glance, the way the men sized each other up with the confidence of those who had already proven themselves. She was the only woman in this cycle, and the whispers started before she even reached the barracks. Sergeant Vance Kellerman stood at the entrance to the range complex, his arms crossed over a chest that seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. His eyes tracked Riley as she approached with her sea bag, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered face. "You must be Ashford," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of authority that came from 20 years of shaping Marines. His gaze dropped to her frame, lingering just long enough to make his skepticism clear. "They told me you qualified expert at your last unit." "Yes, Sergeant," Riley replied, her voice steady and clear. Kellerman nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Well, expert in an infantry battalion and expert here are two different things, Corporal. This course has a 60% washout rate. Most of them are men who have been shooting their whole lives." His pause was deliberate. "You understand what I am saying?" Riley met his eyes without flinching. "I understand, Sergeant. Before we dive into this journey, drop a comment and let us know what state you are watching from. Maybe you have seen similar situations in your community where someone had to prove themselves against the odds." The barracks was a long concrete building with rows of metal bunks that gleamed under fluorescent lights. Riley chose a rack at the far end, away from the clusters of men who had already begun to form the tribal bonds that would define the next 8 weeks. She stowed her gear with practiced efficiency, aware of the eyes that followed her movements. "Hey, check it out," a voice called from across the room. "It's Corporal Cupcake." Laughter rippled through the barracks. Riley did not turn around. She folded her uniforms with precise corners, each movement deliberate and controlled. The voice belonged to Lance Corporal Derek Harmon, a broad-shouldered Texan whose confidence seemed to expand to fill whatever space he occupied. He sauntered over to Riley's bunk, followed by 2 others who wore the same expression of casual cruelty that often passed for humor in military spaces. "No offense, sweetheart," Harmon said, leaning against the post of her bunk. "But what makes you think you can hang with us? This is not your basic rifle marksmanship. This is the real deal." Riley continued folding, her hands steady. "I qualified for the course same as you," she said quietly. "Yeah, but they have quotas now, right?" Harmon looked back at his audience, playing to them. "Gotta make sure everyone gets a participation trophy." More laughter. Riley finished with her last uniform and placed it in her footlocker. She straightened and finally looked at Harmon directly. His smile faltered slightly under her gaze, which was neither angry nor intimidated, but simply present. "Guess we will find out on the range," she said. Harmon recovered quickly, his grin returning. "Yeah, I guess we will." He pushed off from the bunk and walked away, his entourage following. Over his shoulder, he called back, "Try not to cry when the big guns start going off, Cupcake." Riley sat on her bunk and began to lace her boots. Her fingers moved through the familiar pattern, the motion automatic and soothing. Around her, the barracks hummed with the energy of young men preparing for a challenge, their voices full of swagger and certainty. She let the sound wash over her like static. In the pocket of her utilities, hidden beneath the layers of camouflage fabric, was a single photograph. She did not need to look at it to know every detail. The image of an old man standing on a ridge, his weathered face partially obscured by shadow, his eyes holding secrets that the camera could not capture. On the back, written in careful script, were 3 words that she had memorized long ago. "Trust the fundamentals." Riley finished with her boots and stood. Through the windows, She could see the rifle range stretching into the distance, the targets small and dark against the pale earth. Tomorrow morning, they would all zero their rifles. Tomorrow morning, the real assessment would begin. She took a deep breath, drawing the gun oil and sage into her lungs, and began her pre-sleep routine. The others might spend their evening talking and bonding. Riley had other preparations to make. She closed her eyes and began the visualization, seeing the sight picture with perfect clarity, feeling the trigger break, watching the bullet fly true. Nobody in that barracks knew that she had been preparing for this moment for 5 years. Nobody knew about the countless hours spent in the mountains of Montana, learning from a ghost who the Marine Corps had long since stopped looking for. Nobody knew that every fundamental of marksmanship had been burned into her muscle memory by a man whose name appeared in hushed conversations among scout snipers, always with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. They would learn soon enough. The alarm sounded at 04:30, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Riley was already awake, had been for 20 minutes, her internal clock calibrated to wake before any external demand. She dressed in silence, while around her the barracks erupted into the controlled chaos of Marines preparing for their first day of training. The morning was cold, the kind of desert cold that shocked the system after the heat of the previous day. They formed up outside the barracks in 4 ranks, their breath visible in the pre-dawn air. Sergeant Kellerman appeared from the darkness like a specter, his boots striking the pavement with measured authority. "Good morning, Marines," he called, his voice cutting through the morning. "Welcome to day 1 of advanced marksmanship. Before the sun sets today, some of you will realize you do not belong here. By the end of this week, half of you will be gone. By the end of this course, only the best will remain." He paced in front of them, his eyes scanning the ranks. "This is not basic training. Nobody here cares about your feelings. Nobody here cares about your excuses. The only thing that matters is what you can do with a rifle at distance. If you cannot perform, you will be removed. It is that simple." Riley stood in the back rank, her eyes forward, her breathing controlled. She could feel Harmon somewhere to her left, his presence like a weight in her peripheral vision. "Today, we zero our rifles," Kellerman continued. "Some of you think you already know how to shoot. You are wrong. Everything you think you know, forget it. We start from scratch. We build from the fundamentals up." His eyes found Riley in the formation. "And if you cannot handle the recoil of AM-40, there is no shame in requesting reassignment now." A few snickers rippled through the formation. Riley's expression did not change. They marched to the armory as the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Each Marine was issued an M40A5 sniper rifle, the weapon heavy and purposeful in their hands. Riley accepted hers from the armorer, her fingers automatically checking the bolt, the trigger, the scope mounting. The rifle felt like meeting an old friend after a long absence. At the 100-yard line, they assumed their positions on shooting mats that had been worn smooth by countless Marines before them. Riley settled into prone, the rifle nestled into her shoulder, her cheek pressed against the stock. The position was so familiar it felt like coming home. Kellerman walked the line, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped behind each shooter, observing their position, making corrections. When he reached Riley, he stood there longer than he had with the others. "Your position is good," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been surprise. "Where did you learn to shoot?" "My father, Sergeant," Riley replied, which was not entirely a lie. The man who had taught her had become like a father, even if no blood connected them. Kellerman grunted. "We will see." He moved on. The morning was dedicated to zeroing, the tedious but essential process of adjusting the scope so that point of aim matched point of impact. Riley fired her 3-round groups with mechanical precision, adjusted her scope, fired again. Around her, she could hear the frustration of others, the muffled curses, the excuses called out to the instructors. Harmon was 3 positions to her left, and she could hear him talking between strings of fire. "This rifle pulls left," he complained to anyone who would listen. "The scope must be damaged." "It is not the rifle," one of the other instructors called back. "Fix your fundamentals." Riley tuned it out. She focused on her breathing, on the sight picture, on the gentle squeeze of the trigger. Her groups were tight, clustered within a 2-inch circle at 100 yards. She made minute adjustments, walking her point of impact into perfect alignment with her point of aim. By noon, most of the shooters had achieved an acceptable 0. A few were still struggling, their targets decorated with scattered impacts that spoke of fundamental problems. Kellerman called for a ceasefire and walked the line, examining each target. When he reached Riley's target, he stopped. The paper showed a series of 3-round groups, each one tight, each one precisely adjusted from the last. The final group was centered perfectly in the bull, the 3 holes nearly touching. Ashford, Kellerman said, his voice carrying down the line. Everyone else had stopped working on their rifles to listen. This is what a proper 0 looks like. Note the consistency. Note the precision. This is the standard. Riley felt the eyes on her back, felt the weight of attention that she had spent her entire career trying to avoid. She kept her expression neutral, her eyes on her rifle. Harmon's voice cut through the silence. Beginner's luck, Sergeant. Wait until we start shooting at real distances. Kellerman turned slowly to face Harmon. Is that so, Lance Corporal? You think Corporal Ashford just got lucky? His tone was dangerous, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. No disrespect, Sergeant, Harmon backtracked. I just mean that zeroing at 100 yards is not the same as shooting at 800. You are correct, Kellerman replied, which is why this afternoon we will be shooting at 300, 500, and 700 yards. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I am sure you will show us all how it is done. The afternoon session was brutal. The wind had picked up, gusting across the range in unpredictable patterns. At 300 yards, the targets seemed to dance in the heat shimmer, and the wind pushed bullets in ways that required constant adjustment and calculation. Riley settled into her position for her first string at 300. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in her mind she heard his voice, patient and certain. Wind is just information, Riley. Read it. Trust it. Adjust for it. Do not fight it. Work with it. She opened her eyes and observed the mirage through her scope, watched the patterns of heat distortion, noted the movement of vegetation at the target line. She calculated her correction, held her sight picture, and pressed the trigger. The rifle barked, the recoil pressing into her shoulder like a familiar hand. Through her scope, she watched the vapor trail of the bullet, watched it curve slightly in the wind, watched it strike dead center in the silhouette target. She fired her remaining 4 rounds, each one connecting with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. When the range went cold and they walked down to score their targets, Riley showed 5 impacts clustered in the center mass, a group that would fit under a playing card. Harmon's target had 3 impacts in the scoring zone and 2 complete misses. His face was red with frustration and something darker, something that looked like humiliation beginning to curdle into anger. As they walked back to the firing line, he moved close to Riley, his voice low enough that the instructors could not hear. You know what I think? I think you have been here before. I think you had someone give you the wind calls. Riley kept walking, kept her eyes forward. Think whatever you want. I am watching you, Cupcake. You slip up even once, and everyone will see that you do not belong here. Riley stopped and turned to face him fully. Her voice was quiet but clear. I am not your enemy, Harmon. The target is your enemy. Maybe focus on that. She walked away, leaving him standing there, his jaw tight with unspoken rage. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the range in shades of gold. Tomorrow they would shoot at even greater distances. Tomorrow the pressure would increase. Riley was ready. She had been ready for 5 years. The second week brought rain, and with it a different kind of challenge. The range became a test of endurance as much as skill, with Marines lying in mud that soaked through their uniforms and turned every position into an exercise in discomfort. Riley embraced it the way she had been taught, accepting the cold and wet as simply another variable to account for. They had moved to the 1,000-yard line, and the targets were barely visible even through the high-powered scopes. At this distance, everything mattered. A single degree of temperature change could shift a bullet's impact by inches. The spin of the Earth itself became a factor in the calculations. This was where shooters became snipers or washed out trying. Sergeant Kellerman had been joined by another instructor, a gunny named Price who moved with the economy of motion that marked true veterans. Price was shorter than Kellerman, his face weathered like old leather, and his eyes held the flat calm of someone who had seen men die and made peace with it. He watched Riley with particular interest, though he said nothing directly to her for the first 3 days. On Thursday morning, as the class gathered for their briefing, Price finally spoke. "Ashford," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "You're shooting like someone who has done this before. Who trained you?" The barracks went quiet. Every eye turned to Riley. She stood at attention, her face composed. "My father taught me the basics, Gunny. I practiced on my own after that." Price studied her for a long moment. "Your father must be one hell of a shot. Those are not basics you are demonstrating out there. That is advanced fieldcraft." Riley said nothing. Price let the silence stretch, then nodded slowly. "Keep it up." He moved on, but Riley could feel the weight of new scrutiny, a different quality of attention than she had faced before. Harmon was deteriorating. His scores had improved from that first disastrous day, but he remained in the middle of the pack, and it was eating at him. He had arrived at the course with a reputation, had told anyone who would listen about his exploits at his previous unit, about the competitions he had won, about the records he had set. Now he was being outshot by a woman half his size, and the cognitive dissonance was transforming him into something ugly. He began a campaign of small cruelties. Riley's gear would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. Her shooting mat would be moved when she was not looking. Comments followed her everywhere, whispered just loud enough to hear, but quiet enough to deny. The other Marines watched this with varying degrees of discomfort, but none intervened. This was how it worked. You proved yourself, or you did not. Riley endured it with the same quiet patience she applied to everything else. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting, that the best response to petty harassment was excellence. So she shot, and her groups stayed tight, and her scores climbed the leaderboard that Kellerman posted each Friday. By the end of the second week, Riley was ranked first in the class. Harmon was seventh. The weekend brought no relief. While other courses might grant liberty, advanced marksmanship required its students to spend their off hours in study. They pored over range cards, practiced calculating corrections for wind and distance, memorized the ballistic tables until they could recite them in their sleep. Riley used the time to disappear into the hills behind the base, finding quiet places where she could practice the meditation techniques that kept her centered. It was on one of these solitary walks that Gunny Price found her. She was sitting on a rocky outcrop overlooking the range complex, her eyes closed, her breathing deep and regular. She heard his approach, but did not move, did not break her concentration until he spoke. "That is interesting," Price said, settling onto a rock nearby. "That breathing pattern. I have only seen one other person use that exact technique." Riley opened her eyes slowly, her mind coming back from the quiet place she had been cultivating. She looked at Price, waiting. "I was a student once," Price continued, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Long time ago. Different war. We had an instructor who was legendary, even then. Guy named Thorne. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne. He taught us things that were not in any manual, techniques that came from years of being downrange, of taking shots that nobody else could make." His gaze shifted to Riley. "He also taught us that breathing pattern. Said it came from somewhere else, somewhere older than the military." Riley kept her expression neutral, but her heart had accelerated. She knew the name, knew it better than anyone in the Marine Corps. Elias Thorne, the ghost sniper, the legend who had vanished into the mountains after his retirement, who the Corps had lost track of and eventually stopped looking for. "I never met him," Riley said carefully, "but I have heard the stories." Price smiled, and it was a knowing expression. Everyone has heard the stories. Most people think they are exaggerated. Most people do not believe that anyone could be that good. He stood, brushing dust from his utilities. "But I was there, Ashford. I saw what he could do, and I am seeing something familiar in how you shoot." He started to walk away, then paused. "There's a reason we stopped talking about Thorne in official channels. The Corps does not like ghosts, does not like legends that operate outside the system. If someone had learned from him, if someone carried his techniques forward, they would be wise to keep that quiet, at least until they had proven themselves beyond any doubt. He looked back at Riley. You understand what I am saying? Yes, Gunny, Riley replied. Good. Price resumed walking, his boots finding the path down the hillside with practiced ease. See you Monday, Corporal. We start moving targets next week. Riley sat for a long time after he left, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. Price knew, or at least suspected, but his warning had been clear. She needed to continue being careful, needed to prove herself so thoroughly that when the truth eventually emerged, no one could question her right to be there. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of Montana, of the cabin where Thorne lived, of the countless hours they had spent together on the range he had built in a hidden valley. He had found her at her lowest point, a young Marine struggling with confidence, questioning whether she belonged in the service at all. He had seen something in her that she had not seen in herself, and he had spent 5 years drawing it out, shaping it, honing it into something extraordinary. Trust the fundamentals he had written on that photograph. She pulled it from her pocket now, looking at his weathered face, his knowing eyes. She wondered if he knew where she was, if he was watching somehow, if he approved of the path she was walking. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and gun oil. In the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of the base settling into evening, the rumble of trucks, the cadence of running formations. Tomorrow was Sunday, and they would have one more day of rest before the course intensified again. Riley stood and made her way back down the trail. In the barracks, Harmon and his friends would be drinking contraband beer and talking about the week ahead, about the moving targets and the stress shoots, and all the ways the instructors would try to break them. They would be sharpening their knives for Monday, preparing their next round of harassment. Let them come. Riley had been forged by a ghost in the mountains of Montana. Whatever they threw at her, she would be ready. Monday morning arrived with a wind that howled down from the mountains like something alive and angry. The moving target range was a different beast entirely, a stretch of desert where steel silhouettes traveled on rails at varying speeds and distances. This was where the course separated those who could shoot from those who could hunt. Kellerman stood before the assembled Marines, his voice raised against the wind. Moving targets do not care about your perfect position. They do not wait for your breathing cycle. They demand adaptation, anticipation, and decision-making under pressure. Today, half of you will realize that punching paper at a known distance is nothing like engaging a target that refuses to cooperate. The course was set up in stages. First, targets moving laterally at 300 yards. Then angling targets at 500. Finally, the nightmare scenario, targets appearing randomly at unknown distances between 400 and 800 yards, moving in unpredictable patterns for only seconds at a time. Riley drew the third shooting position. She watched the first 2 Marines carefully, noting how the wind pushed the targets on their rails, how the speed varied slightly with each pass, how the timing required a different calculation than she had ever practiced. Thorne had taught her moving targets, but those had been deer in the Montana wilderness, not steel plates on mechanical rails. Ashford, you are up, Kellerman called. Riley moved to the firing line and settled into position. The rifle felt solid in her hands, an extension of her will. She controlled her breathing, letting her heart rate settle despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The first target began its journey across the range, sliding from right to left at a steady pace. She led it, calculating the distance and the wind and the speed, finding that precise point where bullet and target would intersect. The trigger broke cleanly. Through her scope, she watched the target ring with impact, the steel singing even over the wind. Hit, the spotter called. For more targets followed in rapid succession. Riley engaged each one with the same methodical precision, her mind processing the variables faster than conscious thought. Let adjust for wind, squeeze, follow through. Each target rang. Each spotter called hit. When a ceasefire sounded, Kellerman walked over to where she lay. That was textbook Corporal. Where did you learn to shoot movers? Riley kept her eyes on the range. Hunting, Sergeant. Deer do not stand still. Kellerman made a noise that might have been approval. Well, your deer hunting skills just put you at the top of the class again. Keep it up. Harmon was positioned 6 spots down from Riley. She did not watch him shoot, but she heard the results. 3 hits out of 5 targets, which was respectable but not exceptional. When he finished his string, he slammed his rifle down on the mat with enough force that Kellerman materialized beside him instantly. You got a problem with your weapon, Lance Corporal? Harmon looked up, his face flushed. No, Sergeant. The words came through gritted teeth. Then treat it with respect. That rifle is worth more than you are. Kellerman's voice was ice. Do it again, and you're dropped from the course. The afternoon session brought the chaos of random targets. The Marines sat behind their rifles, waiting for the horn that would signal the appearance of a target somewhere in the vast expanse of range before them. They would have 30 seconds to locate it, range it, calculate their correction, and make the shot. It was designed to simulate the pressure of a real engagement, where time and precision had to coexist in impossible balance. Riley waited with the same patient focus she brought to everything. When the horn sounded, her eyes swept the range in a pattern Thorn had drilled into her. Near to far, left to right, looking for movement, for shape, for anything that broke the natural pattern of the landscape. She found the target at 600 yards, angling away at a moderate pace. 600, moving left to right, 15 miles per hour wind from 9 o'clock. She murmured to herself, the data organizing into the mental model that would guide her shot. She dialed her scope, settled her crosshairs with proper lead, and fired. The target dropped. In competition shooting, moving targets that were hit would fall flat to confirm the impact. This one tumbled backward off its rail. Kill shot, the spotter confirmed. Center mass. They ran 10 iterations of the random target drill. Riley made 8 kills and 2 hits. It was the best performance of the day, better even than some of the instructors who ran the course for demonstration. During the break, Gunny Price pulled Riley aside. Walk with me, he said quietly. They moved away from the other Marines toward a section of the range that was not in use. Price stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious. I made some calls this weekend. Called in some favors with people who were around when Thorn was still teaching. His eyes were sharp, measuring. There was a rumor, years back, that he had taken on a private student after he retired. Someone he saw potential in. Someone he wanted to pass his knowledge to before he got too old. Riley said nothing, her face carefully neutral. The thing is, Price continued, Thorn made people nervous when he was active duty. He was too good, too unorthodox. He did things that should not have been possible, and he could not always explain how he did them. The Corps appreciated his results, but never quite trusted his methods. When he retired, they were almost relieved. His gaze intensified. If someone showed up with his exact skill set, with his techniques and his mindset, there would be questions. Uncomfortable questions. I understand, Gunny, Riley said. Do you? Price stepped closer, because what I saw today was not just good shooting. That was something else. That was the kind of performance that makes people start investigating. And if they investigate, they might find things that complicate your career. His voice softened slightly. I'm not saying you should hide your abilities. I am saying you need to be ready for what comes with them. What comes with them? Riley repeated. Recognition, Price said, and all the problems that come with being recognized. He paused. Thorn could not handle it. The attention, the expectations, the way the Corps wanted to turn his art into a formula they could mass produce. It broke something in him. That is why he left. That is why he became a ghost. Riley felt the weight of those words settle over her. She had seen glimpses of that brokenness in Thorn, in the way he sometimes stared into the distance, as if seeing ghosts of his own. He had never spoken about why he left, had only taught her to shoot and to think, and to understand that excellence came with a price. I will handle it, Riley said quietly. Price studied her for another moment, then nodded. I believe you will. He started walking back toward the range. Just remember, when the time comes and people ask questions, you have at least one ally who understands what Thorn was trying to preserve. That evening, Riley found her bunk area had been vandalized. Nothing obvious, nothing she could report without sounding petty, but her gear had been disturbed, her carefully organized equipment scattered and disordered. A photograph had been taken from her footlocker, the one of Thorne standing on the ridge. It sat propped up on her pillow with a crude message scrawled on a piece of paper beside it. "Is this your boyfriend?" The note read, "Maybe he should come teach you how to shoot." Riley stared at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully returned it to its place in her pocket. Around her, the barracks was quiet with the careful silence of people pretending not to notice. She methodically reorganized her gear, her movements calm and precise, giving no indication of the cold anger that had settled in her chest. Harmon sat on his bunk across the room, watching her with poorly concealed satisfaction. Riley met his eyes once, briefly, and saw what lived there. Not just jealousy or wounded pride, but something deeper and more dangerous. He needed her to fail, needed it the way drowning men need air. She turned away and continued her work. Tomorrow they would be shooting from unconventional positions, from barricades and vehicles and rooftops. Tomorrow the course would demand even more adaptability, even more skill. Tomorrow she would show them all that Thorne had chosen his student well. The unconventional shooting positions broke most of the remaining students who had made it through the first 3 weeks. Shooting from behind barricades required different muscle memory, different bone structure, different ways of managing recoil and controlling breath. The human body was not designed to shoot accurately while twisted around concrete barriers or balanced on vehicle hoods, and the course exploited every limitation. Riley excelled here too, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. While other Marines struggled to adapt their fundamentals to awkward angles and unstable platforms, she moved through the positions with fluid confidence. Shooting from the roof of a Humvee, prone over the hood of a truck, around the edge of a concrete wall, each position seemed to present no challenge to her. Kellerman had stopped being surprised. Now he simply watched, his expression thoughtful and increasingly troubled. After Riley completed a particularly difficult stage, engaging targets from a rooftop at multiple distances while accounting for both elevation and a gusting crosswind, he called her over. "Ashford." His voice was quiet enough that others could not hear. "I have been doing this for 15 years. I have trained hundreds of Marines to be snipers. Most of them are good. Some of them are very good." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're something else entirely. Where did this really come from?" Riley stood at attention, her rifle slung across her chest. "I trained hard, Sergeant. I had good instruction." Kellerman shook his head slowly. "This is not about training hard. This is about someone who has shot in these exact positions before, who has muscle memory burned in so deep it looks like instinct." He leaned closer. "I am not trying to jam you up, Corporal, but when you graduate this course, and you will graduate, people are going to ask questions. Higher-ups are going to want to know how a corporal with no special background just waltzed through the hardest shooting course in the Marine Corps. You need to have better answers than what you have been giving me." Riley met his eyes. "What if the truth is complicated, Sergeant? Then you better figure out how to uncomplicate it." Kellerman straightened. "Because one way or another, the truth is coming out. Better it comes out on your terms." That night, the harassment reached a new level. Riley returned from the head to find her bunk soaking wet, her sleeping bag drenched with water that had been carefully poured to look like she had wet herself. Laughter erupted from Harmon's corner of the barracks, quickly stifled but unmistakable. She stood looking at her ruined gear for a long moment. The other Marines in the bay were suddenly very interested in their own business, eyes averted, conversations dying. This was the moment Riley understood where she was supposed to break, supposed to cry or rage or report it or quit. This was what Harmon needed, what he had been building toward. Instead, Riley calmly stripped the wet gear from a rack, carried it outside to the drying area, and returned with a dry sleeping bag from her spare gear. She remade her bunk with the same precise corners she always used, then laid down and went to sleep. No tears, no outburst, no reaction at all. The silence in the barracks was heavy with disappointment. Week 4 brought stress shoots, scenarios designed to elevate heart rate and adrenaline before requiring precision shots. They ran obstacle courses, did burpees and sprints, then had to immediately engage targets at distance while their bodies screamed for oxygen and their hands shook with exertion. This was where Harmon finally found his edge. He was bigger, stronger, more physically powerful than Riley. He crushed the obstacle courses, finished the runs with breath to spare. When it came time to shoot, his hands were steady while hers trembled from fatigue. But trembling hands could be managed if the fundamentals were sound. Riley had learned to shoot while exhausted in the Montana mountains, running up and down ridges with a weighted pack while Thorne timed her and waited at the top of targets. She knew how to find stillness inside chaos, how to make her body obey even when it wanted to quit. Harmon scored well on the stress shoots. Riley scored better, not by much, but enough. Always enough. His frustration reached a breaking point on Thursday. During a break between courses, he approached Riley directly, his face flushed with more than exertion. "You know what everyone is saying, right?" His voice carried across the range. "They're saying you must have slept with someone to get here. That is the only way someone like you could perform like this." The range went silent. Every Marine, every instructor stopped what they were doing. This was the line, the one that could not be uncrossed. Riley looked at Harmon with the same calm she had maintained since arriving. "Is that what you think? I think there is no way you are this good without cheating somehow." His voice was loud now, playing to the audience. "I think it would help. I think someone gave you the answers." Kellerman was moving toward them, his face thunderous, but Gunny Price got there first. He stepped between Riley and Harmon, his voice cutting like a blade. "Lance Corporal Harmon, you just made a very serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to support it?" Harmon faltered, suddenly aware of how far he had gone. "I just meant that it does not make sense, Gunny. How can she be this good?" Price turned to look at Riley, and there was something in his expression that might have been pride or recognition or both. "Maybe she is just better than you, Lance Corporal. Did you consider that possibility?" "But Gunny," Harmon tried again. Price cut him off. "You have two options. You can apologize to Corporal Ashford right now, or you can repeat your accusation to the commanding officer, and we can start an investigation." His pause was deliberate. "Of course, if we investigate and find nothing, you will be the one facing charges for false accusations and creating a hostile environment. Your call." Harmon looked around at the assembled faces, finding no support, no sympathy. Even his friends had stepped back, distancing themselves from the scene. He looked at Riley, and what she saw in his eyes was not quite hatred, but something close to it. "I apologize," he said, the words forced through clenched teeth. Riley nodded once. Apology accepted. Price turned to address the entire assembled group. "Let me make something clear to all of you. In my 30 years in the Marine Corps, I have seen exactly 2 people shoot the way Corporal Ashford shoots. 2. One of them was the finest sniper this Corps has ever produced, a man who saved more lives than anyone will ever know. The other is standing right here." His voice hardened. "So if anyone else wants to question her abilities, wants to suggest she is cheating or getting special treatment, you better bring more than jealousy and wounded pride. You better bring proof." He let that settle over them like a weight. "Now get back to work. All of you." The range came back to life slowly, Marines returning to their positions with sidelong glances at Riley. Harmon walked away stiff-backed, his humiliation complete and public. Kellerman approached Price, and Riley heard a murmur. "You just confirmed everyone's suspicions about who trained her." Price shrugged. "Maybe it is time people knew. Maybe it is time Thorne got some credit for what he built." Riley stood frozen, her mind racing through implications. Price had essentially confirmed her connection to the legendary Ghost Sniper in front of the entire class. There would be no taking it back, no returning to anonymity. The secret she had guarded for 5 years had just been cracked open. That evening, as she sat alone on her bunk, cleaning her rifle with methodical precision, she felt the photograph in her pocket like a burning coal. "Trust the fundamentals," Thorne had written. But which fundamentals? The ones about shooting, or the ones about truth and honesty, and facing what could not be avoided? The course had 4 weeks remaining. In that time, everyone would be asking questions, piecing together the story, trying to understand how a corporal from nowhere had learned to shoot from a man who had disappeared in a legend. The ghost had reached out from the mountains and touched this place, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Riley finished with her rifle and set it aside. Tomorrow they would shoot at 1,200 yards, the longest distance on the course. Tomorrow she would show them that some legacies were worth preserving, that some ghosts taught lessons that the living could not. The 1,200-yard line was where legends were made or broken. At that distance, targets were barely visible even through high-powered optics. The bullet would spend nearly 2 seconds in flight, enough time for wind to push it dozens of inches off course. Gravity pulled harder at such ranges, requiring elevation adjustments that seemed impossible. Everything had to be perfect. Riley had never shot at 1,200 yards. Thorns Valley in Montana did not have the space for it, and her previous units had not offered the opportunity. This would be a true test, the first time she would face something completely new since arriving at the course. The morning briefing was tense. Word had spread about the confrontation with Harmon, about Price's public confirmation of Riley's connection to the ghost sniper. The other Marines looked at her differently now, with a mixture of awe and resentment and curiosity. She was no longer just the quiet corporal who shot well. She was the inheritor of a legend, and that changed everything. Kellerman addressed the class with his usual gravity. At 1,200 yards, everything you think you know about shooting becomes inadequate. The fundamentals still apply, but they must be executed with such precision that even the smallest error becomes catastrophic. His eyes found Riley. Some of you may have natural talent. Some of you may have excellent training. None of that matters if you cannot adapt to conditions you have never faced. They moved to the extended range in vehicles, driving past the normal firing lines into the deep desert. The targets were set on a ridge that shimmered in the morning heat, barely visible shapes against the rocky terrain. The wind was already building, swirling in unpredictable patterns created by the mountains and valleys. Riley drew the 5th shooting position. She watched the first 4 Marines carefully, studying not just their technique, but the way the wind affected their bullets. Each shot left a vapor trail that curved and dipped, painting pictures of the invisible forces at work. She memorized the patterns, built mental models, calculated corrections. When her turn came, she settled behind her rifle with a calmness that belied the racing of her heart. This was the unknown, the place where her training met its limit. But Thorne had taught her something more valuable than specific skills. He had taught her how to learn, how to observe, how to trust her instincts when knowledge ran out. She studied the mirage through her scope, watched the heat waves dance and shimmer. The wind was tricky, gusting from multiple directions, changing moment to moment. She would have to time her shot for a lull, or better yet, find the rhythm in the chaos and work within it. Riley closed her eyes and listened. This was something Thorne had taught her that no manual contained. The wind made sounds, subtle differences in tone and pitch that corresponded to speed and direction. It was not precise science, but it was information. Everything was information if you knew how to receive it. She opened her eyes, made her adjustments, and took up the slack in her trigger. The wind shifted, settling into a pattern she had been tracking. She pressed the trigger the moment the pattern repeated. The rifle bellowed. Through her scope, she tracked the bullet's vapor trail, watched it arc impossibly high before beginning its descent. 2 full seconds passed, time enough to doubt every calculation, every adjustment, every instinct. Then the target rang, the steel singing across the distance. Hit, the spotter confirmed. Center mass. Riley fired 4 more rounds, taking her time between each shot, waiting for the wind to cooperate. For more hits. When she stood up from the line, Kellerman was there with an expression she could not quite read. "How did you make that wind call?" he asked. The conditions were completely inconsistent. Riley considered her answer carefully. "I listened to it, Sergeant. The wind has patterns if you pay attention long enough." Kellerman shook his head slowly. Thorne used to say the exact same thing. Half of us thought he was crazy. The other half thought he was a genius. His voice dropped. You know what is going to happen now, right? Price basically put a spotlight on you yesterday. By tomorrow, the battalion commander is going to want to meet you. By next week, someone from Quantico is going to be asking questions. Riley nodded. I understand, Sergeant. Do you? Because this is not just about you anymore. This is about Thorne, about his legacy, about whether his methods were legitimate or just some kind of voodoo that happened to work for him. His eyes were intense. They're going to want to know everything. How you met him, what he taught you, whether his techniques can be replicated. What if they cannot be replicated? Riley asked quietly. Then you better hope you can teach others what he taught you. Otherwise, you will just be another anomaly, and the Corps does not know what to do with anomalies except study them until they break. That afternoon, Riley was summoned to the battalion headquarters. She stood at attention in front of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, a lean man with silver at his temples and ribbons that spoke of multiple combat deployments. Gunny Price stood off to the side, his presence both reassuring and ominous. Corporal Ashford, Webb began, his voice measured. I have been reviewing your performance in the advanced marksmanship course. It is quite remarkable. His eyes moved to a file on his desk. It is also unexplained. Your service record shows no special schools, no competitive shooting background, no indication of where these skills came from. I had a private instructor, sir, Riley said, after hours on my own time. Webb nodded slowly. This instructor, would his name be Master Sergeant Elias Thorne? Yes, sir. The room was silent for a moment. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying Riley with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Master Sergeant Thorne was one of the finest snipers this Corps has ever produced. He was also one of the most controversial. His methods were unorthodox. His results were undeniable but unrepeatable. When he retired, he left behind more questions than answers. Riley said nothing, waiting. I knew Thorne, Webb continued. Served with him in Fallujah. Watched him make shots that should not have been possible. Watched him train Marines who went on to save countless lives. His voice hardened. I also watched the Corps try to systematize his approach, turn his art into a checklist, and fail completely. He left because we could not understand what he was trying to teach. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the base. Now here you are, apparently able to do what he did, which raises interesting possibilities and uncomfortable questions. He turned back to Riley. The question is, Corporal, are you willing to help us understand? Or are you going to follow his path and disappear into the mountains when we ask too much? Riley considered her words carefully. Sir, Master Sergeant Thorne taught me that excellence in shooting is about more than technique. It is about understanding, about connection, about seeing the whole system rather than just the mechanics. He taught me to listen and observe and trust what I cannot always explain. She paused. I do not know if that can be put into a manual. Maybe it cannot, Webb said, but you're going to try anyway, because that is what we do in the Marine Corps. We find what works and we share it. He returned to his desk. You will complete this course. Based on your current scores, you will finish first. Then you will be assigned to the Sniper Instructor School at Quantico. You will teach others what Thorne taught you, or at least as much of it as can be taught. And if I cannot teach it, sir, then at least we will know. Webb's expression softened slightly. Thorne was my friend, Corporal. I respected him even when I did not understand him. If you carry his legacy, I want to see it honored, not buried. But that means bringing it into the light, accepting the scrutiny that comes with it. I understand, sir. Riley was dismissed. As she left the office, Price walked with her. That went better than I expected, he said quietly. Webb is one of the good ones. He will protect you from the worst of it. The worst of what, Gunny? The people who will want to dissect you, figure out what makes you different, turn you into a science experiment. Price's voice was grim. Thorne went through it. It almost destroyed him. The difference is, you have warning. You have time to prepare. They walked in silence for a moment. How do I prepare for that? Riley asked. By being so good, they cannot question it. By teaching at least one other person to shoot the way you do. By proving that what Thorne built was real. Price stopped and looked at her directly. And by remembering that you are a Marine first, a sniper second. Do not let the legend consume you the way it consumed him. Riley returned to the barracks as the sun set behind the mountains. The other Marines watched her enter, their expressions ranging from respect to envy to something like fear. She had become something other, something that existed outside the normal hierarchy and understanding. The ghost student, the inheritor of techniques that bordered on mystical. She sat on her bunk and pulled out the photograph. Thorne stared back at her, his weathered face inscrutable. Had he known this would happen? Had he prepared her for this moment? Or simply taught her to shoot and hope for the best? Trust the fundamentals, the back of the photograph read. Riley understood now that the fundamentals were not just about shooting. They were about staying grounded when everything else tried to pull you into the air, about remaining human when others wanted to make you a legend. The 5th week brought night shooting, and with it a darkness so complete it felt like shooting into the void. The Marines wore night vision devices that turned the world into shades of green and black, distorting depth perception and making even familiar movements feel alien. At distance, targets were barely visible even with thermal optics, reduced to faint heat signatures that could easily be mistaken for rocks or animals. This was where technical skill met primal instinct, where the thinking mind had to surrender to something deeper. Riley had done limited night shooting with Thorne, mostly hunting predators that threatened his property. But he had taught her the most important lesson about darkness, that it was not an enemy, but a different kind of information. The first night evolution was a disaster for most of the class. Shots went wild. Calculations fell apart. Even experienced shooters struggled to adapt to the sensory deprivation. 3 Marines were dropped from the course that night, unable to achieve even minimal qualifying scores. Riley approached it differently. While others fought the darkness, tried to force their daylight techniques onto the night, she let herself sink into it. She closed her eyes behind her night vision device and listened, feeling the temperature of the air, sensing the subtle movements of wind that she could not see. When she opened her eyes again, the green world of her optics felt less alien, more like just another way of seeing. Her shots found their marks. Not every time, not with the precision she achieved in daylight, but enough. Enough to pass. Enough to maintain her position at the top of the dwindling class. Harmon was struggling. The night had stripped away whatever confidence he had rebuilt after his public humiliation. His shots scattered across the target range, hitting dirt more often than steel. Riley could hear him cursing in the darkness, could feel his frustration radiating like heat. On the 3rd night of evolution, something changed. Riley was in position, waiting for her turn on the firing line, when she heard movement behind her. Before she could turn, hands shoved her hard from behind. She stumbled forward, her rifle slipping from her grasp, her night vision device knocked askew. "Oops." Harmon's voice came from the darkness. "Did not see you there, Corporal. Pretty dark out here." Riley caught herself before falling, adjusted her night vision, and retrieved her rifle. She checked it carefully for damage, her movements deliberate despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Around them, other Marines had noticed, but no one said anything. In the green darkness, it could have been an accident. Could have been. "You good, Ashford?" Kellerman's voice cut through the night. He had seen it, Riley realized. Had seen exactly what it was. "Yes, Sergeant," Riley replied. "Just lost my footing." Kellerman moved closer, his face unreadable behind his night vision. "Ashford, take Lance Corporal Harmon's shooting position. Harmon, you are bumped to last. We will see if some extra waiting time helps you focus." The range went silent. Everyone understood what had just happened, the subtle punishment disguised as schedule adjustment. Harmon said nothing, but Riley could feel his hatred in the darkness like a physical weight. She moved to the firing line and engaged her targets with mechanical precision. Each shot was a statement. Each hit a refusal to be intimidated or deterred. When she finished her string with a perfect score, she stood and walked past Harmon without looking at him. The incident was not reported officially, but it marked a shift. The other Marines who had remained neutral, who had watched the ongoing harassment without intervening, began to choose sides. Some gravitated toward Riley, offering quiet words of support or advice. Others aligned with Harmon, their resentment of her abilities outweighing any sense of fairness. The class was fracturing, and Riley was the fault line. On Friday, Gunny Price pulled her aside again. "This is getting dangerous," he said without preamble. "Harmon is not stable. I have seen this before, seen what happens when someone cannot accept being outperformed." He looked at her seriously. "You need to watch your back, Ashford, especially in the field exercises coming up." The field exercises were the culmination of the course. 3 days in the mountains where students would operate as sniper teams, stalking targets, building hides, taking shots under realistic conditions. It was where everything came together, where the skills learned in isolation had to function as part of a larger system. It was also where accidents could happen, where someone could get lost or injured far from help, where the difference between training and malice could be impossible to prove. "I will be careful, Gunny," Riley said. Price shook his head. "I'm not just talking about being careful. I'm talking about being ready. If he comes at you out there, you need to be prepared to defend yourself." His voice dropped. "And if that happens, I will back your story. Whatever you need to do to stay safe, I will make sure it is recorded correctly." Riley felt the weight of those words. Price was giving her permission, telling her that he would support her even if things turned violent. It was both reassuring and terrifying, confirmation that the threat was real enough to warrant such measures. That weekend, the remaining students were given liberty for the first time in 5 weeks. Most went into town, desperate for normalcy, for alcohol and civilian clothes, and a few hours away from the constant pressure. Riley stayed on base and returned to her spot in the hills, the rocky outcrop where she could see the entire range complex spread below her. She sat for a long time, her mind working through scenarios and possibilities. The field exercise would put her alone in the wilderness, with people who resented her, at least one of whom might wish her actual harm. She would be miles from any help, relying on a radio that might or might not work in a mountain terrain. Thorne had taught her more than shooting. He had taught her survival, tracking, land navigation, all the skills that came from decades of operating in remote environments. She had assumed those lessons were about making her a better sniper. Now she understood they might have been about keeping her alive. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of amber and red, Riley made her decision. She would not hide from the threat. She would not request a different team or ask for special protection. She would go into the mountains and complete the mission, and if Harmon or anyone else came at her, she would deal with it the way Thorne had taught her to deal with threats. Directly, decisively, and without hesitation. The photograph was in her pocket, as always. She pulled it out and studied Thorne's face in the fading light. Trust the fundamentals. She understood now that the fundamentals included more than marksmanship. They included situational awareness, threat assessment, and the willingness to act when action was required. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. The remaining 18 Marines loaded into trucks with their field gear, their rifles, enough supplies for 3 days in the mountains. They drove for hours into terrain that grew progressively more rugged and remote. When they finally stopped and disembarked, they were in a valley that looked like it had been untouched since the earth was new. Kellerman briefed them on the exercise. "You will work in pairs. Each team will receive a set of coordinates for your target location. You will stalk to within effective range, establish a hide, and wait for the target to appear. You will have 1 shot to make a kill. Miss, and you fail the exercise. Compromise your position before the shot, and you fail. Fail to work as a team, and you fail." He began reading off team assignments. Riley waited, knowing already who she would be paired with. Some combinations were too predictable to be coincidence. "Ashford and Harmon," Kellerman called. "You're team 6. Riley saw the flash of something dark cross Harmon's face, quickly concealed. She slung her pack and picked up her rifle. Across the staging area, Harmon was doing the same, his movements stiff with tension. They received their mission packet and map coordinates. Their target area was the most remote, the deepest into the mountains, the farthest from any support or supervision. Riley studied the terrain, already planning routes and contingencies, already preparing for whatever was coming. Harmon moved close enough to speak quietly. "Just you and me out there, Cupcake. No instructors, no witnesses. His smile was not friendly. Better hope you are as good at surviving as you are at shooting. Riley met his eyes. I guess we will find out. They moved into the mountains as the sun climbed higher. Behind them, the other teams dispersed in different directions, spreading across the valley like seeds on the wind. Ahead, the peaks rose sharp and unforgiving against the sky. Somewhere in those mountains, Riley would either prove herself completely or face a threat that no amount of marksmanship could overcome. The ghost had trained her for this moment. She would not let him down. The mountains swallowed them whole. Within an hour of leaving the staging area, the valley had disappeared behind ridges of rock and scrub, and the only sounds were their boots on stone and the wind moving through the draws. Riley led the way, navigating by map and compass, her pace steady but not aggressive. Behind her, Harmon followed in silence that felt heavier than words. They were supposed to be a team, supposed to be communicating and coordinating. Instead, they moved like strangers forced together by circumstance, each carrying their own thoughts and intentions. Riley's hand never strayed far from the knife on her belt, and she made sure to never let Harmon move directly behind her for long. By midday, they had covered 8 miles of rough terrain. Riley called a halt near a rock formation that offered shade and a view of their back trail. She dropped her pack and pulled out her map, checking their position against the coordinates they had been given. "We're making good time," she said, her voice neutral. "Should reach the target area by late afternoon." Harmon dumped his pack and pulled out a water bottle. He drank deeply, his eyes on Riley. "You know what I cannot figure out?" His tone was conversational, almost friendly. "How someone like you ended up learning from someone like Thorn. What is the story there? Did you track him down? Did he find you? Or is there some other connection?" Riley took a drink from her own water. "Does it matter?" "Yeah, it matters." Harmon moved closer, settling onto a rock across from her. "It matters because I want to understand. I want to know what makes you so special that a legend decided to teach you everything he knew. Maybe he just saw potential," Riley said quietly. Harmon laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Potential, right? See, I think it is something else. I think maybe there is some family connection, some history that you're not sharing. Because the alternative is that he just randomly picked you, and that does not make sense." Thorn was careful. Thorn was deliberate. He would not waste his time on just anyone. Riley said nothing, recognizing the probing for what it was. Harmon was trying to get inside her head, trying to find pressure points he could exploit. She had seen interrogation training before, had learned the techniques. This was amateur hour by comparison. "You know what really gets me?" Harmon continued. "All those years, Thorn could have been teaching Marines, could have been passing on his knowledge to people who were already in the system. Instead, he hides in the mountains and teaches some random corporal who never even deployed." He leaned forward. "That is not just wrong. That is selfish. That is a betrayal of everyone who could have benefited from his experience." There was truth in that, Riley knew. She had thought about it herself during the long hours in Montana, had wondered why Thorn chose her, whether she deserved the gift he was giving. But she had also seen the scars in him, the damage the Corps had inflicted by trying to systematize what could not be reduced to formulas. He had his reasons, Riley said. Maybe they were not reasons you would agree with, but they were his to make. And now you are here, playing secret keeper, pretending like you earned this. Harmon's voice hardened. "You did not earn anything, Ashford. You got lucky. You got a cheat code that the rest of us did not have access to. And everyone is treating you like you are special, when really you are just the beneficiary of one old man's bad judgment." Riley stood and shouldered her pack. "We should keep moving. We still have 4 miles to cover." Harmon did not move. "What if I said I'm not going any further? What if I said I am done with this whole exercise, done pretending like I'm going to work with someone who does not belong here?" "Then you fail," Riley said simply. "And I complete the mission alone. You think you can do that? Navigate this terrain by yourself, establish a hide, make the shot, all without a spotter?" "I know I can." They stared at each other across the small clearing, the tension thick enough to cut. Riley saw the calculation in Harmon's eyes, saw him weighing options and possibilities. Whatever he decided in that moment would determine how the next 2 days played out. Finally, he stood and picked up his pack. "Let's get this over with." They moved deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew steeper, more technical, requiring them to navigate cliff bands and boulder fields. Riley moved with confidence born of countless hours in Montana wilderness, reading the land, choosing routes that balanced speed with safety. Harmon struggled more, his superior strength less useful here than agility and balance. By late afternoon, they reached the area where their target was supposed to appear. It was a valley carved by an ancient river, with a dirt road running through it. According to their mission brief, a vehicle would drive that road at some point in the next 48 hours. They were to establish a hide overlooking the road, wait for the vehicle, and engage the driver with a single shot. Riley scanned the valley through her binoculars, looking for the ideal location. She found it on the western slope, a jumble of rocks and scrub that would provide concealment and a clear line of sight to the road. The range would be approximately 600 yards within their capabilities, but far enough to require solid fundamentals. There, she pointed, that is where we build the hide. Harmon studied the location through his own binoculars. That is a lot of climbing. There are closer positions that offer worse sight lines and less concealment. Riley was already moving toward the slope. We do it right, or we do not do it at all. The climb took an hour. By the time they reached the position, the sun was touching the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold. They had perhaps 90 minutes of good light left to build their hide and prepare for the wait. Riley began arranging rocks and vegetation to create a natural-looking position that would blend into the hillside. Harmon helped, but his movements were mechanical, lacking the care and attention to detail that made the difference between a good hide and a great one. Riley found herself redoing his work, adjusting placements, ensuring that nothing looked artificial from below. As darkness fell, they settled into the hide. It was tight quarters, barely enough room for 2 people and their equipment. They would be spending the next day and a half in this space, taking turns sleeping and observing, waiting for a target that might appear at any moment. The night was cold. Riley pulled on an extra layer and arranged her sleeping bag behind the firing position. Harmon did the same, his movements stiff and uncomfortable. They established a watch schedule, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Riley took the first watch, grateful for the solitude, grateful to not have to wonder what Harmon might do while she slept. She settled behind her rifle and scanned the valley through her night vision. The road was a pale ribbon in the darkness, empty and still. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, so bright in the mountain darkness that they cast faint shadows. It was beautiful and lonely, and exactly the kind of environment where Thorne had been most at home. Riley thought about him now, wondered what he would make of this situation, of her being paired with someone who clearly wished her harm, of being forced to trust someone who had proven himself untrustworthy. She thought he would probably say something about how the universe had a way of testing you exactly where you were weakest, of forcing you to confront what you most wanted to avoid. Behind her, Harmon settled into his sleeping bag. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Riley listened to it, alert for any change, any indication that he was not actually sleeping. But his exhaustion was real, his body finally surrendering to the demands of the day. She kept watch, her eyes on the valley, but her awareness spread wider, monitoring Harmon, monitoring the night, monitoring the subtle signals that might warn of danger. This was the test, she understood, not just of her shooting skills, but of her ability to function under threat, to maintain focus when everything in her wanted to be watching her back instead of watching for the target. The hours passed slowly. The stars rotated overhead. The valley remained empty. And in the hide, Riley maintained her vigil. The ghost sniper student alone with her vigilance and her doubts, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the valley in shades of gray that gradually warmed to gold. Riley had maintained watch through the coldest hours of the night, her body stiff from immobility, but her mind sharp. When Harmon stirred awake, she finally allowed herself to relax slightly, to eat a cold meal and drink water that tasted like plastic and minerals. "Your turn," she said quietly, moving away from the rifle. Harmon took her position without comment. He settled behind the scope, adjusting it to his eye relief, scanning the valley below. Riley watched him for a moment, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched tight. Whatever was building in him had not dissipated with sleep. She crawled to the back of the hide and closed her eyes, but true sleep would not come. Instead, she drifted in that twilight state between waking and sleeping, aware of every sound, every shift in the hide. Her hand remained close to her knife, her body ready to move despite its exhaustion. 2 hours later, Harmon's voice cut through her rest. Movement on the road. Riley was instantly alert. She moved forward and took the spotting scope, scanning the valley. A vehicle was approaching from the north, a military Humvee traveling at moderate speed. It was still 2 miles out, but it was clearly their target. Range? Harmon asked, his eye already pressed to his scope. Riley did the calculations automatically. 620 yards when it reaches the marker. Wind is 3 to 5 miles per hour from the west. She glanced at the mirage boiling off the valley floor. Temperature is rising fast. You will need to account for vertical shift. I know how to shoot, Harmon snapped. Riley said nothing, just continued to observe through the spotting scope. The vehicle grew closer, its features becoming distinct. She could see the driver now, a mannequin set up to simulate a human target. This was the moment they had been building toward, the culmination of 8 weeks of training. 500 yards, Riley called. Wind holding steady. Harmon's breathing had changed, faster now, less controlled. Riley recognized the signs of stress, of pressure overwhelming technique. She had seen it before in other shooters, the way the mind could sabotage the body when the stakes felt too high. 400 yards. You need to slow your breathing. Shut up, Harmon hissed. I have got this. The vehicle continued its approach. Riley watched through the spotting scope, her own mind running the calculations, seeing the shot in her imagination. At 300 yards, Harmon would need to take it. Any closer and the angle would be wrong. The shot would be compromised. 300 yards, Riley called. Wind picking up slightly, now 5 to 7 from the west. Harmon fired. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, followed by the distant sound of impact. But it was not the clean ring of steel on steel. Through the spotting scope, Riley saw the dust plume where the bullet had struck the road 10 feet in front of the vehicle. Miss, she said quietly. Low and right. The vehicle continued past the position, disappearing around a bend in the road. Their one shot was gone. The exercise was failed. Harmon exploded. He rolled away from the rifle, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. This is your fault. Your wind call was wrong. Riley kept her voice level. My wind call was accurate. You pulled the trigger. You rushed the shot. Harmon's hand shot out and grabbed Riley's collar, yanking her toward him. The hide was so small that his sudden movement brought them face to face, his breath hot with anger. You set me up. You gave me the wrong information on purpose. Riley's training took over. Her hand moved to his wrist, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that would force him to release his grip. At the same time, her other hand went to her knife. Let go. For a frozen moment, they were locked together, his strength against her technique, his rage against her cold calculation. Then Harmon saw the knife in her hand, saw the absolute lack of fear in her eyes, and something in him recognized that he had crossed a line he could not uncross. He released her and scrambled backward, his chest heaving. You are crazy. You pulled a knife on me. You grabbed me first, Riley said, her voice steady. And out here, that is assault. She kept the knife visible, but lowered. We can call this in right now if you want. Let the instructors sort out who did what. Harmon looked at her with something approaching hatred, but underneath it was fear. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he had underestimated her in every possible way. She was not just a better shooter. She was better prepared, better trained, more dangerous than he had imagined. Just forget it, he muttered. Let's get out of here. They broke down the hide in silence, packing their gear with mechanical efficiency. The mission was failed, which meant they would both receive failing grades for this portion of the course. But given Riley's overall scores, she would still graduate. Harmon's position was less certain. This failure might be enough to push him over the edge into being dropped from the course entirely. They began the hike back to the staging area. Harmon led this time, moving fast, almost recklessly, as if distance and speed could somehow erase what had happened. Riley followed at her own pace, watchful but no longer worried. Whatever threat Harmon had represented, it had been neutered by his failed shot and his failed assault. They covered the 8 miles in under 4 hours, arriving at the staging area as other teams were still filtering in from their positions. Kellerman was there, clipboard in hand, checking off teams as they arrived. His eyes moved between Riley and Harmon, reading the tension, the space they maintained between each other. "Report," he said simply. "Mission failed, Sergeant," Riley replied. "Target engaged at 300 yards. Shot missed low and right." Kellerman's eyes moved to Harmon. "That accurate, Lance Corporal?" "Yes, Sergeant," Harmon said, his voice flat. "Who took the shot?" "I did, Sergeant." Kellerman made a note on his clipboard. "Whose wind call?" "Corporal Ashford provided the wind and distance information," Harmon said, and Riley could hear him laying the groundwork for his excuse. But the conditions were difficult. Mirage was heavy. Kellerman looked at Riley. "Corporal, anything to add?" Riley considered her options. She could tell the truth, explain that Harmon had rushed the shot, had allowed stress to override his training. She could describe how he had grabbed her afterward, how she had been forced to defend herself. All of it would be believed. All of it would probably result in Harmon being dropped from the course and facing disciplinary action. But she thought about Thorne, about the lessons that went beyond shooting, about how sometimes mercy was stronger than justice, how sometimes letting someone keep their dignity was worth more than proving you were right. "No, Sergeant," Riley said. "The miss was just part of the training. We both learned from it." Kellerman studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression said he knew exactly what she was not saying. "Dismissed. Both of you get some chow and rack time. Final exercise briefing is at 1800 hours. They walked away in different directions. Riley did not look back, did not need to see Harmon's reaction to her decision to protect him. She had made her choice, and she would live with it. That evening, Gunny Price found her in the chow hall. "Heard your team failed the field exercise." "Yes, Gunny," Riley said. "Heard there might have been some complications beyond just a missed shot." Riley met his eyes. "Nothing I could not handle, Gunny." Price nodded slowly. "Harmon is being dropped from the course. Not because of the field exercise, but because his overall scores are not sufficient. He will be gone by tomorrow morning." His voice lowered. "I also heard he put hands on you out there. That true?" "It was handled, Gunny." "Maybe so, but you should know that Kellerman is writing up a report based on his observations and your body language when you came in. Whether you press charges or not, there will be a record." Price paused. "You protected him out there, gave him a chance to keep some dignity. I was generous, more generous than he deserved. It was what felt right," Riley said quietly. "Thorne would have done the same," Price said. "He was hard, but he was never cruel, never used his skills to hurt people who were already beaten." He stood to leave. "One more week, Ashford. One more week, and you graduate top of your class. Then the real work begins." Riley finished her meal alone, watching through the windows as the sun set behind the mountains. Somewhere in those peaks, Harmon was probably packing his gear, preparing to leave the course that had broken him. She felt no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, just a tired recognition that some battles were won before they were ever fought, that the real test had never been about shooting, but about who she chose to be when the shooting stopped. The photograph was in her pocket. She did not need to look at it to know what it said. Trust the fundamentals. She had trusted them, all of them, not just the ones about marksmanship, but the ones about character and choice and mercy. Tomorrow would bring the final exercise, the culmination of everything she had learned. But tonight, she had passed a different kind of test, one that had no score and no record, but that mattered more than any target she would ever engage. The final week arrived with a clarity that felt almost surreal. Harmon's departure had changed the atmosphere in the barracks, lifted a weight that Riley had not fully appreciated until it was gone. The remaining 15 Marines moved with a different energy now, focused entirely on the culmination of their training rather than the interpersonal conflicts that had dominated the previous weeks. Kellerman gathered them on Monday morning with a solemnity that marked the occasion. You have made it to the final week. That alone is an accomplishment. 80 Marines started this course. 15 of you remain. But graduation is not guaranteed. This week will test everything you have learned, everything you have become. The final exercise will determine who earns the title of Marine Corps Sniper and who goes home with nothing but the memory of how close they came. The final exercise was legendary among those who had attempted it. A single shot at an unknown distance between 800 and 1,500 yards, an unknown time over a 72-hour period, under field conditions that would be deliberately hostile. Wind, heat, cold, fatigue, all of it designed to push shooters to their absolute limit. Success required not just technical skill, but mental endurance, the ability to maintain readiness when every instinct screamed for rest. They were divided into individual hides scattered across miles of mountain terrain. No teams this time, no spotters, no support. Each Marine alone with their rifle and their training, waiting for a target that might appear at dawn or dusk or in the brutal heat of midday. Riley drew position 7, a ridge overlooking a broad valley where the target could appear anywhere along a 3-mile stretch. She humped her gear up the mountain as the sun climbed higher, feeling the weight of the pack and the rifle and the responsibility of everything that had led to this moment. The hide she built was the best she had ever constructed. Every rock placed with intention, every branch of sage positioned to break up her outline, every detail considered and reconsidered until it was as close to invisible as human hands could make it. Thorne had taught her that the hide was not just concealment, but a statement of respect for the environment, a way of asking permission to exist in a space that did not belong to you. By evening, she was settled in position, her rifle resting on its bipod, her scope calibrated and ready. The valley before her stretched vast and empty, painted in the colors of approaching sunset. She ate a cold meal and drank water and settled into the mindset that would sustain her for however long this took. The first night passed without incident. Riley maintained watch and shifts, allowing herself brief periods of rest, but never full sleep. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness, 14 other Marines were doing the same thing, each alone with their thoughts and their anticipation. Dawn brought wind, strong and gusty, blowing across the valley in patterns that shifted moment to moment. Riley watched it through her scope, reading the mirage, noting the way vegetation moved at different distances. This was the challenge Kellerman had promised, conditions that would make the shot nearly impossible for anyone who had not learned to truly understand wind. The morning stretched into afternoon. The temperature climbed into the 90s, and the mirage became so heavy that looking through the scope was like looking through water. Riley drank carefully from her water supply, rationing it for the long haul, keeping her body temperature regulated as best she could. It was in the heat of the afternoon, when focus was hardest to maintain, that she saw movement. Far across the valley, perhaps 1,200 yards distant, a vehicle appeared on a dirt road she had barely noticed during her reconnaissance. It moved slowly, deliberately, and mounted on its bed was a steel silhouette. Riley's heart rate accelerated, but her training took over. She breathed deeply, letting her pulse settle, letting her mind shift into the state Thorne had called operational clarity. She ranged the target through her scope, confirming the distance. 1,240 yards. The wind was 15 to 20 miles per hour, gusting higher, coming from her right at roughly 4 o'clock. She had shot at 1,200 yards on the range, but never in conditions like this, never with wind this strong and unpredictable. The calculations ran through her mind automatically, but she knew that math alone would not be enough. This required feel, intuition, the kind of understanding that came from thousands of hours of trigger time and absolute trust in fundamentals. Riley made her adjustments, dialing her scope for distance and wind. The crosshairs settled on the target, but she did not fire. Not yet. She watched the mirage, watched the vegetation at the target line, waited for the pattern she had been tracking all morning to repeat itself. The wind gusted, then settled into a lull. The mirage steadied. The vegetation at 1,200 yards showed the consistent deflection she had been waiting for. This was the moment. Her finger took up the slack on the trigger. Her breathing stopped at the natural respiratory pause. The sight picture was perfect, the crosshairs steady despite the distance and the wind and the weight of everything riding on this single shot. The trigger broke cleanly. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's vapor trail arc across the impossible distance, watched it curve in the wind exactly as she had calculated, watched it drop with gravity and time until it intersected with the target. The steel silhouette rang with impact, the sound carrying across the valley several seconds after the shot, confirmation in audio of what her eyes had already told her. The target fell backward, indicating a kill shot center mass. Riley let out her breath slowly. She had done it. Everything Thorne had taught her, everything she had practiced and refined and made her own, had come together in that single perfect moment. The ghost sniper's legacy lived on in her shot, in the way she had read the wind and trusted the fundamentals and made the impossible possible. She did not move from her position. The exercise protocol required her to remain in place until officially released by the instructors. She settled back into observation mode, her body relaxing slightly now that the shot was complete, her mind already processing what had just happened. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when she heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Through her scope, she saw a Humvee with Kellerman and Price in the front seats, driving toward her position. They parked at the base of her ridge and began climbing. When they reached her hide, both instructors stood for a moment, studying it. Kellerman shook his head slowly. I walked right past this position twice while setting up the valley. Did not see it either time. He looked at Riley with something approaching awe. How did you learn to build a hide like this? Practice, Sergeant, Riley said simply. Lots of practice. Price knelt down and peered into the hide. 1,240 yards in 20-mile-per-hour wind. That is not a shot most snipers would even attempt. His eyes found hers. That is the kind of shot legends make. Riley said nothing, just began the process of breaking down her position, packing her gear with the same methodical care she brought to everything. You know what happens now, right? Kellerman said. You just recorded the best final exercise performance in the history of this course. Better than anyone in the records. Better even than, he paused, well, better than anyone. Better than Thorne, Price finished for him. He smiled slightly. The student has equaled the teacher, maybe even surpassed him. They helped Riley pack her gear and guided her down the mountain. In the valley below, the other Marines were still in position, still waiting for their targets to appear, still hoping for their chance at success. Riley had taken hers and made it count. As they drove back toward the base, Kellerman glanced at her in the rearview mirror. You have changed something here, Ashford. Changed the way we think about what is possible, about what can be taught and learned. Thorne tried to tell us that, tried to show us, but we were not ready to listen. His voice softened. Maybe we are ready now. Riley looked out the window at the mountains passing by. Somewhere in peaks like these, Thorne was living his quiet life, removed from the institution that had not understood him. She wondered if he somehow knew what had just happened, if he felt the echo of his teachings reaching across the distance. Trust the fundamentals. She had trusted them absolutely, and they had not failed her. The ghost had trained her well, had given her gifts that would now be passed on to others. The legacy would continue, refined and shared, no longer hidden in the mountains but brought into the light where it could do the most good. The sun was setting as they reached the base, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. Tomorrow there would be graduation, ceremony, speeches, and recognition. But tonight, Riley simply sat with the satisfaction of a shot well made, a mission accomplished, a teacher honored. The night before graduation, Riley could not sleep. She lay in her bunk while the barracks settled into the quiet rhythm of exhausted Marines finally allowing themselves to rest, but her mind would not surrender to fatigue. Tomorrow she would stand on a parade deck and receive recognition for something she had earned through years of hidden training, and the weight of that revelation pressed on her like a physical thing. She rose quietly and slipped outside into the desert night. The air was cool against her skin, carrying the familiar scent of sage and dust. She walked without destination, letting her feet carry her toward the hills where she had spent so many solitary hours during the course. The stars were brilliant overhead, uncountable and ancient. Riley found her usual spot on the rocky outcrop and sat, pulling her knees to her chest. From here, she could see the entire base spread below, lights twinkling in the darkness like a mirror of the stars above. "Thought I might find you here." Riley turned to see Gunny Price climbing up the trail behind her. He moved quietly for a man his age, his boots finding purchase on stone with practiced ease. He settled onto a rock nearby, his face barely visible in the starlight. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "Yes, Gunny." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Price pulled out a small flask, took a sip, then offered it to Riley. She hesitated, then accepted. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, warming her from the inside. "I want to tell you about the last time I saw Thorne," Price said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "It was after he retired, maybe 6 months before he disappeared completely. We met at a bar off base, just two old snipers sharing war stories. He looked at the stars above. He told me that he was done trying to make the Corps understand what he knew. Said it was like trying to teach poetry to people who only wanted instruction manuals." Riley listened, holding the flask, but not drinking again. But then he said something else, something I did not understand at the time. He said he had found someone young enough to learn the right way, someone who had not been contaminated by bad training and institutional thinking. He said he was going to pass on everything, all of it, and let the universe decide what to do with it. Price turned to look at Riley. "He was talking about you." "I know," Riley said softly. "He chose you very carefully, Ashford. Watched you for months before approaching you. Research your background, your temperament, your potential. Thorne did not do anything randomly. When he picked you, it was because he saw something that the rest of us missed." Riley felt emotion tightening her throat. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow you're going to stand in front of a lot of senior officers and receive a lot of attention, and I need you to remember what this is really about." Price's voice hardened slightly. "It is not about you being special or gifted or chosen. It is about preserving knowledge that would have been lost. It is about honoring a man who gave everything to his craft and got nothing but suspicion in return. It is about making sure that what he built survives him." "I understand, Gunny." "Do you?" "Because there are going to be people who want to study you, dissect your techniques, turn what you do into a curriculum. They're going to ask you to explain things that maybe cannot be explained. They're going to want guarantees that you can teach others to shoot like you shoot." Price leaned forward. "And you need to be prepared for the possibility that you cannot. That what Thorne gave you was unique to the relationship between teacher and student, impossible to replicate in a classroom." The thought had occurred to Riley many times during the course. She had watched other Marines struggle with concepts that seemed obvious to her, had tried to explain techniques that felt intuitive but sounded mystical when put into words. How did you teach someone to listen to the wind? How did you explain the feeling of a shot being right before you took it? "What if I fail?" Riley asked quietly. "What if I cannot teach what he taught me?" "Then you fail honorably," Price said. "You do your best, you share what can be shared, and you accept that some things die with their creators." He stood, his joints popping in the cold air. "But I do not think you will fail. I think Thorne saw something in you that went beyond just being able to shoot. I think he saw someone who could carry the weight of this legacy without being crushed by it." He handed her something small and metallic. Riley looked down to see a shooting badge, worn and tarnished with age. The name engraved on the back was E. Thorne. "He left this with me before he disappeared," Price said. "Told me to give it to the right person when the time came. I think tomorrow is that time." Riley closed her fingers around the badge, feeling the weight of history and expectation. "Thank you, Gunny. Do not thank me. Just do not waste what he gave you." Price started back down the trail, then paused. "And Ashford, try to get some sleep. You have earned it." Riley remained on the outcrop for another hour, holding the badge, thinking about the man who had owned it. Thorne had been real, flesh and blood, not the ghost that legend had made him. He had struggled and doubted, and ultimately chosen to walk away from an institution that could not appreciate what he offered. But before walking away, he had planted a seed, spent 5 years nurturing it, ensuring that his knowledge would survive even if he did not. She was that seed, grown now into something that could stand on its own. Tomorrow she would begin the next phase, would attempt to pass on what had been passed to her. Whether she succeeded or failed, she would honor the gift by trying. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when Riley finally returned to the barracks. She had perhaps 2 hours before reveille, 2 hours to rest her body, if not her mind. She lay down on her bunk and closed her eyes, and this time sleep came, deep and dreamless. She woke to the sound of Marines preparing for the graduation ceremony. The barracks was alive with energy, with the nervous excitement of men about to achieve something they had worked months to earn. Riley dressed in her service uniform, the fabric crisp and clean, the creases sharp. She pinned Thorne's shooting badge inside her breast pocket, hidden from view but present, a talisman against whatever was coming. The graduation was held on the parade deck as the sun climbed toward noon. Families had arrived, proud parents and siblings and spouses gathered to witness the moment. Riley had no one, had not invited anyone, preferred to keep this achievement separate from her regular life. But as she stood in formation with the other 14 graduates, she did not feel alone. Thorne was with her in spirit, and Price and Kellerman stood to the side as witness to what his teaching had produced. Lieutenant Colonel Webb presided over the ceremony. He spoke about sacrifice and dedication, about the sacred trust given to those who carried the sniper's rifle. Then he began calling names, presenting each graduate with their sniper qualification badge and certificate. When he reached Riley's name, his voice carried across the parade deck with particular weight. Corporal Riley Ashford. Not only did Corporal Ashford successfully complete this course, she did so with the highest scores in its history. Her performance on the final exercise was exceptional by any standard, demonstrating mastery of skills that few Marines ever achieve. Riley marched forward and came to attention in front of Webb. He pinned the badge to her uniform, the eagle and crosshairs catching the sunlight. Then he leaned close and spoke quietly, so only she could hear. Thorne will be proud. I am proud. Now comes the hard part. He stepped back and saluted. Riley returned the salute crisply. As she marched back to formation, she saw Gunny Price watching her with an expression of satisfaction and something deeper, something like hope. The ceremony concluded with the traditional rifle salute, 15 Marines firing in perfect synchronization, the reports echoing across the base. Then it was over, and they were dismissed into the celebration, into the congratulations and photographs and promises to stay in touch. Riley stood slightly apart from the festivities, watching the families embrace their Marines, watching the joy and relief play out across the parade deck. She felt the badge inside her pocket, Thorne's badge, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had done it, had proven that his methods worked, that his legacy deserved to survive. Tomorrow she would report to Quantico to begin her assignment as an instructor. Tomorrow the real test would begin, the attempt to pass on knowledge that had been given in isolation and secrecy. But today, in this moment, she simply stood in the sun and let herself feel what she had earned. The Ghost Sniper student had become a Marine Corps sniper. The legend would continue, refined and shared, brought into the light where it belonged. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, an old man might be smiling, knowing that his final student had honored his teaching in the best possible way. 6 months later, Riley stood on the instructor platform at Quantico, watching a new class of students struggle with the fundamentals she had once mastered in the mountains of Montana. The assignment had been everything Gunny Price warned it would be, challenging in ways that had nothing to do with shooting and everything to do with translation, with finding words for knowledge that lived in muscle memory and instinct. Some days were victories. A struggling student would suddenly understand wind reading after Riley explained it through the metaphor of listening rather than calculating. Another would break through their mental barriers when she taught them Thorne's breathing technique. These moments felt like vindication, proof that the legacy could be shared. Other days were frustrations. Students who wanted formulas and checklists, who could not accept that some aspects of shooting required feel and intuition. Administrators who demanded quantifiable metrics for techniques that defied measurement. The constant pressure to systematize what Thorne had specifically refused to reduce to a system. But Riley persisted, finding her own voice as a teacher, blending Thorne's wisdom with her own understanding. She was not him, would never be him, but she carried forward what mattered most: the respect for the craft, the patience with the process, the understanding that true mastery required more than technical proficiency. On a Friday afternoon, as the students were securing their weapons and preparing for liberty, Kellerman appeared at the range. He had been assigned to Quantico as well, their paths intersecting again in ways that felt inevitable. He watched Riley work with a student who was struggling with long-range shooting, noted the patience in her instruction, the way she adapted her teaching to the individual. "Walk with me," he said after the range was cleared. They moved away from the firing line, toward the tree-line that bordered the facility. Kellerman was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant targets. "I got a call yesterday," he finally said, "from a number I did not recognize. Montana area code." His eyes found Riley's. The voice on the other end did not identify himself, but I knew who it was. I would know that voice anywhere. Riley's heart accelerated. "Thorne, he asked about you. Wanted to know how you were doing, how the teaching was going." Kellerman smiled slightly. "I told him you were doing fine, that you had graduated top of your class, and were now passing on what he taught you." There was a long silence on the line. Then he said something I did not expect. "What did he say?" Riley asked quietly. "He said, 'Tell her I am proud. Tell her she did not need my badge because she earned her own. And tell her that sometimes the best students become better teachers than their instructors, because they remember what it was like to not understand.'" Kellerman paused. Then he hung up. Riley felt emotion welling up, tried to keep her expression neutral. He is still out there. Still out there, still watching somehow. Kellerman looked at her seriously. He also said one more thing, right before he hung up. He said that if you ever need him, there's a place in the mountains where you first met. He will check there once a year, on the anniversary. If you leave a message, he will find it. They walked in silence for a moment. Riley thought about that valley in Montana, the cabin where Thorne lived, the range where she had spent 5 years learning to see the world through a scope. She had not been back since starting the course at Pendleton, had not known if she would ever return. "Are you going to go?" Kellerman asked. "Someday," Riley said, "when I have something worth telling him, when I can show him what his teaching became." "Fair enough." Kellerman started back toward the buildings. "You have students waiting, Corporal, or should I say Sergeant? Your promotion came through. Effective immediately." Riley felt a surge of satisfaction. "Sergeant." Another step forward, another validation of the path she had chosen. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Do not thank me. You earned it." Kellerman paused. "Thorne earned it too. Through you. Whatever else happens, remember that. You're not just carrying his legacy. You are adding to it, making it your own." That evening, Riley sat in her quarters and composed a letter. She wrote about the course, about the challenges and the triumphs, about the students who were learning and the ones who were struggling. She wrote about Harmon and how that confrontation had taught her as much about character as about shooting. She wrote about Price and Kellerman and Webb, about the people who had protected her and guided her and believed in the possibility of what she represented. She wrote about the shot at 1,240 yards, about the moment when everything he had taught her came together in perfect synthesis, about the feeling of honoring him through excellence, of proving that his methods deserved to survive and thrive. Finally, she wrote about her fears, about whether she was good enough to teach what he had taught, whether the knowledge would survive the translation from mountain isolation to institutional structure, about the responsibility of carrying a legend forward and the constant worry that she would fail him. She sealed the letter in a waterproof container and set it aside. Someday, perhaps next year, she would return to Montana and leave it in the place where their journey had begun. Someday she would stand in that valley again and feel his presence in the wind and the sage, and she would know whether she had lived up to the gift he had given her. But today, right now, there were students to teach and skills to pass on and a legacy to preserve. Riley stood and looked at herself in the mirror, at the sergeant's stripes that would soon be on her uniform, at the shooting badge that represented everything she had become. She thought about the scared corporal who had arrived at Camp Pendleton 8 months ago, unsure whether she belonged, carrying a secret she did not know how to share. That person felt like someone from another lifetime. Riley had been tested and had not broken, had been challenged and had risen to meet it, had been given a gift and was now paying it forward, imperfectly but honestly, with all the dedication she could muster. The photograph was still in her pocket, worn now from months of handling. She pulled it out and looked at Thorne's weathered face one more time. Trust the fundamentals. She had trusted them through everything, and they had brought her here, to this moment, to this purpose. Tomorrow she would return to the range and teach another class of Marines to shoot. Some would excel, and some would struggle, and all of them would benefit from what Thorne had built and she had carried forward. The Ghost Sniper's legacy lived on not in darkness and isolation, but in the light, shared and honored and made real through every student who learned to see the world through a scope and respect the sacred responsibility of precise fire. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite part or character. Maybe you have experienced a situation where someone surprised everyone by revealing hidden abilities, or perhaps you know someone like Riley who carried the weight of a mentor's legacy. Share your thoughts and stories. We love hearing how these narratives connect with your own experiences. Riley put the photograph away and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to honor what she had been given. But tonight, she slept with the peace that came from knowing she had done her best, had remained true to the fundamentals, had proven that some legacies were worth preserving no matter the cost. The ghost had trained her well. Now she would train others, passing the torch forward into a future that Thorne might never see, but had helped to shape. The circle was complete, yet also just beginning. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, an old man smiled in the darkness, knowing that his final student had become exactly what he had hoped she would be. A teacher, a guardian of knowledge, a keeper of the flame.